We're going back to the first game of the 1972 World Championship between Boris Spassky and Robert James Fischer, which took place in Iceland. d4, knight to f6, c4, e6, knight to f3, d5. The Queen's Gambit declined, knight to c3. For Fischer, it's a significant parting of ways. He has a lot of options. D takes c4, Vienna variation, or the more traditional one, which Boris Spassky has also successfully implemented, the bishop to e7. Fischer chose Rogozin variation with bishop to b4 as his game plan, and he is now aiming for a fast development. He developed his bishop, and soon he'll perform kingside castling, pinning the opposing knight. So what are the advantages? Let's take a look at these. If Fischer decides to take the c4 pawn now, he will be unable to make an e4 move to take the opponent's center because the knight is in pin, and there's a knight takes e4 response against it. When the c4 pawn is taken, even the b5 move can be used to protect it. Given all these simple tactics and general ideas, even if you are unfamiliar with the opening theory, important ideas about Boris Spassky's responses may emerge in your mind. What are they? He can continue with a fast development, bishop g5 move, as the opponent did. This also puts the knight in square f6 into a pin. What did we just say? e4 against d takes c4 move is not an option, but with the bishop in g5, a second pawn can now be brought to the center. Alternatively, if you don't want to be bothered by your opponent's c4 move throughout the game, you can end the tension in the center right away with the c takes d5 move. Your opponent's response would be e takes d5 move, because it would have solved the development problem of the queenside bishop in c8. Boris Spassky's choice in the game was e3. He maintains the center's tension while also supporting the c4 pawn. But there's a problem with that. The bishop on the queen side is trapped inside for now. Well, kingside castling, bishop to d3, c5, kingside castling, and now, with the addition of the c pawn to the center fight, the knight to c6 move is simple. As you can see, Fischer has been gradually increasing the pressure on his opponent's center since the opening. And here, Boris Spassky asked his opponent an important question with a3. What are you going to do with your bishop? The bishop takes c3 is, of course, the first response that comes to mind here, and the main move. After b takes c3, Fischer could continue with queen to c7, and there are significant advantages here. First, he weakened the pawn structure of his opponent. This may give him an advantage in the potential endgame. He has also prepared e5's advance with queen c7. Why is this important? The bishop on the queen side has developmental issues because the pawn was in square e6. This bishop can easily participate in the game if the e5 is advanced. It would also put pressure on the vulnerable pawns in the queen c vertical. Boris Spassky, on the other hand, would benefit significantly. A significant advantage like the bishop pair. And now that his pawn is in square c3, it would have strengthened his center. Let's get back in the game. Against a3, Fischer plays the less preferred move, bishop to a5. We can actually understand what he is trying to do. First, Fischer respects the bishop pair and can quickly apply pressure to the center's top with a bishop to b6 move. But what happened? The c5 pawn seems to be undefended. If c takes d5 first, and then e takes d5, and the undefended pawn in c5 is taken, of course, now that b4 is an important demand, the bishop takes c3 move is mandatory, and b takes c3. However, there are significant differences from the previous position. First, the opponent's pawn on the queen side are much weaker, but the most important difference is that there is no longer a center pawn in square d4. So maybe this path is a little better than playing bishop takes c3 move against a3. However, it is difficult to say something definitive. Of course, one of the pawns here could be taken back after queen to a5. Fischer, on the other hand, may prefer a central minor piece game that begins with the bishop g4 and is based on the knight e5. Against bishop to a5, Boris Spassky did not take c5. And, look, since the beginning, both great masters have kept the tension in the center. So, if Fischer takes d4, Boris Spassky's problematic bishop might become free. We just said the same thing about Fischer. These are some good points. And bishop to a5, knight to e2. He's gained control over d4, the center, and he's taken the bishop takes c4 opportunity from its opponent. Now Fischer is increasing the pressure on the center by opening the vertical of the queen with the d takes c4 move. Bishop takes c4 against bishop to b6. Boris Spassky is removing tensions with the d takes c5 move now that the pressure on the center has reached its peak. But this has led to the exchange of queens. Queen takes d1, rook d1, bishop takes c5, b4, bishop to e7. Now it's better to have the bishop in this cross because it can target advanced pawns at some point. Spassky has now developed his bishop with the bishop to b2 move from a stunning cross. Yes, the first phase of Fischer's opening strategy has been completed and is bearing fruit. What is it? In this situation, the queens have exchanged and created some more relief. However, it is still too early to declare the game even, because Fischer has a minor issue to deal with. Here, Boris Spassky's development is better. His pieces are more active. There's a field advantage in the queen side, but the biggest problem Fischer has to solve is his bishop to c8. Yes, we can say that he evened the game this time if he can get his bishop into the game nicely. Robert Fischer took the first step with bishop to d7 move, based on a small tactic, of course. Here, bishop takes f6 after the bishop takes f6, and you won't be able to take the hanging bishop because the rook in a1 would be undefended. Bishop to d7, rook a to c1. Boris Spassky plays a very simple and principled game by moving his rooks to the open vertical. As you can see, Fischer has now protected his bishop first with the rook f to d8 move, as he will now move his other rook to the open c7 vertical. Boris Spassky has placed the knight in d4 here, which is his most passive piece. He'd like to stay with the knight there. However, after the knight takes d4 move and the knight takes d4, the bishop a4 move becomes available, which Fischer did not overlook. Now he demanded the rook that controls the d vertical, and it will not be very comfortable for this rook to leave there. That's why Spassky played bishop to b3. Fischer manages to exchange his problematic bishop. Bishop takes b3, knight takes b3, rook takes d1, rook takes d1. Very nice. The rooks have also been changed, and now rook to c8. For now, rook c2 is not a significant threat because it can be responded with rook d2. That's why Boris Spassky gave his priority to king f1 by centralizing his king at the end of the game. Fischer also moves his king closer to the center with the king f8 move, king to e2, knight to e4. However, because the rook d2 move is no longer possible, rook c2 is now an important demand. For this reason, rook to c1. Great, the rooks have been exchanged. Rook takes c1, bishop takes c1, and f6. It's a safety move, because the pawns will not be in demand when the bishop moves to b2 a little later, when the king approaches the center, activates, and moves away from the protection of its pawns. Knight to a5 against f6. Give the pawn. knight to d6, firmly guarding the pawn, king to d3, bishop to d8. Of course, he wants to take the knight and break the pawn structure. This cannot be allowed, specifically at the end of the game. For this reason, knight to c4, bishop to c7, knight takes d6, bishop takes d6, and so many pieces have been exchanged, we've reached the bishop-pawn ending of the game. Boris Spassky has a minimal advantage, the queen side field superiority, as well as the fact that the king is a little more active. But with an objective assessment, this endgame is definitely a draw, especially for Fischer. As you've seen since the beginning, neither great master took any risk. They are, of course, nervous because this is only the first match of the World Championship game. They're trying to figure out each other. However, Robert Fischer makes an unexpected mistake that no one can explain, and First, we see Spassky's b5 move here. He kept gaining space from the queen side, and Fischer countered with a bishop takes h2 move. Yes, of course, this pawn is not a free pawn. When Boris Spassky saw Fischer take the pawn while standing from his chair waiting for his opponent's move, he calmly sat back in his chair and played the g3 move in cold blood. Now the bishop is unable to move backwards, and it is about to fall. Fischer may prefer h5 to h4 to save his bishop, but he won't be able to make it. King to e2, h4, king to f3, king to e7, king to g3, and it's time to say goodbye to the bishop. First, h takes g3, f takes g3, bishop takes g3, king takes g3. Fischer has a two-pawn advantage over the bishop, but that's definitely not enough. The game is completely lost. However, as we will see later in the game, winning is still not easy. There are some practical difficulties. Fischer continues to activate his king with d6. a4, the pawn is supported. Boris Spassky has protected his pawn with bishop to a3 against king to d5, bishop to c5 against king to e4. Of course, there's a little trap here. It depends on the protection of the bishop's pawn. There is no need for any of this if you play b6 and your opponent plays bishop to e5, and then you play e5 and plan to take this pawn. Against b6, Spassky would prepare the bishop takes b6 move. Because a takes the b6 against a5 move, when the pawn is taken, the b6 move also takes place, making it impossible to stop the pawn. He would have won the game with queening. Therefore, b6 against bishop c5 is not good. Here Fischer sets a little trap for his opponent, a6. What kind of trap? If you play the b takes a6 move carelessly, the game will end in a draw after b gets a6. How so? With the wrong bishop theme. What's the wrong bishop? Your pawn's key square is different than your bishop's. How could a draw be made in this situation? In the king side and center, Fischer has a 3-on-1 advantage. He'll take a simple approach. He'll easily exchange his opponent's single pawn. Even if the a6 loses the pawn. That is, even if the opponent is both a bishop and a pawn ahead, Fischer only had to play his king to a8 and draw the game. Boris Spassky is well aware of this, which is why he prefers b6 over a6 and advances the pawn that won him the game. Well, f5. Fischer should try to exchange his pawns as much as possible. This increases the chance of a draw. King to h4. He wants to take the pawns and advance the king from g5 to g6. Therefore, f4. E takes f4, king takes f4, king takes h5. With the king to f5 move, Fischer has blocked the king's path. Bishop to e3, king to e4, bishop to f2. Boris Spassky wants to draw the opposing king away so that when he moves his bishop, the king can move to g6, take the pawns, and then transfer the king to the other wing. We understand that his opponent is unable to move the king to the opposite wing. First, he will take these pawns. Then he can easily focus his king on the other side. Bishop to f2, king to f5, bishop to h4, e5, bishop to g5, e4, bishop to e3. This structure is now ready and safe. King to f6, king to g4, and there is not much that can be done. King to e5, and now the king has moved on to the g5, king to d5, king to f5, and no matter what, Fischer must lose his pawns. He played a5 first, but after the bishop to f2 move, he had to leave one of the pawns with g5. King takes g5, king takes c4, king to f5, king to b4, king takes e4, king takes a4, king to d5, king to b5, and with king to d6, Fischer leaves the game here. Why? Let's see. Here's an example way to proceed. The far passed pawn is advanced with a4. The pawn is demanded with king c7, and the king a6 move is necessary. Now, bishop to h4. Because the pawn is undefended, you can't move with the king. Therefore, the only option is to advance the pawn, a3. He'd also play bishop f6 against a2, check a1, and take it with bishop even if he's queening. He now has to play the king, but he gives the pawn, and Spassky wins the game easily. Because of the king d6 move, Fischer leaves the game. This was a thrilling World Championship match. Fischer was forfeited because he did not play in the second game, and he was down 2-0 in the World Championship match. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed this video, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to this channel, and click on the bell icon to stay updated with my new videos. Hope to see you in the next videos. Take care!